Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, as dusk settles over the quiet countryside and shadows stretch across the old yard, Linda finally returns home. What she doesn't know is that Quang has been searching everywhere. And just when Linda feels completely alone, a swaying headlight cuts through the darkness, leading to a reunion filled with raw emotion and overwhelming relief. Later, under the soft glow of an oil lamp, Linda reveals a shocking truth she learned on her desperate journey. Whispered news that her ex-husband has already been arrested. Stay until the end, because this chapter reveals not just fear, but healing, protection, and don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The night air hangs thick and heavy as Linda limps down the dirt path, her bare feet torn, smeared with dust and dried blood. Every step feels like dragging chains behind her. The sky above is a bruised purple, the last streaks of sunset fading behind the coconut trees. Her breath comes in shuddering bursts, her eyes glassy with exhaustion. But when the familiar red-tiled roof peeks out from between the tall areca palms, something inside her finally cracks. She drops to her knees. A raw sob tears out of her chest as her palms scrape against the dry earth. Home. I finally made it home. The whisper trembles out of her, fragile as a dying flame. Tears fall, darkening the thirsty soil beneath her. For a long moment, she stays kneeling, trembling, letting the realization settle into her bones. She survived, just barely. When she finally pushes herself back up, the world sways. She grips the bamboo fence to steady herself, then forces her numb legs to carry her toward the house. The moment the old wooden door creaks open, the familiar scent hits her. Aged timber, faint incense, and the dust of long days without laughter. It overwhelms her. A knot forms in her throat as she steps inside, swallowed by deep shadows. Her fingers fumble along the wall until they find the long unused outlet. She plugs in her phone, praying it still works. The screen flickers weakly, glowing like a ghost breathing its last moments. She sinks to the floor beside it, curling in on herself. Quang must be losing his mind right now. He doesn't even know if I'm alive, she murmurs, voice cracking. The empty house seems to breathe with her, each inhale echoing, each exhale trembling. Outside, the faint sounds of the chickens settling for the night drift in. Somewhere in the darkness, a duck quacks sleepily. For a second, those small, ordinary noises ground her. Then fear creeps back in, cold and suffocating. She glances toward the open doorway. Blackness stares back like a blind abyss. He won't find me here. Not tonight. Not here, she whispers to herself. But even she doesn't believe the words. She wraps her arms around her body, pulling her knees close until she is a tight ball of fear and memory. Hours drag by. The darkness deepens. Linda eventually forces herself onto the porch. She stands there, hugging her own shivering body, her eyes locked on the dirt path as if willing someone to appear. The wind picks up, rustling the banana leaves until they sound like footsteps creeping up behind her. Quang, where are you? Her voice barely rises above a breath. She steps down into the yard, calling softly to the chickens. almost desperately trying to remind herself she is still in the real world. "Come on, chick, come here." But nothing moves. No birds stir, not even a faint cluck. The silence sends ice crawling down her spine. Instinctively, she steps back, pressing herself against the cold wooden pillar. Her breath rattles. Every corner of the garden looks like it hides a shadow shaped exactly like the man she fears most. Her ex-husband's silhouette seems etched into the bamboo thicket. Phantom footsteps echo in her mind. She squeezes her eyes shut, nails digging into her palms until warm drops of blood dot her skin. One more night. Just one more night until Quang comes. She chants, like a mantra, like a life raft. Then, a faint light dances on the far end of the path. Linda's eyes snap open. A headlight sways wildly, cutting across the yard like a silver blade. The motorbike sputters, then dies. Silence swallows the world again, until she sees him. Quang. He sprints through the gate, his shirt plastered with sweat, chest heaving. His eyes are wild, red, desperate. "Linda!" His voice fractures as it rips through the night. For a heartbeat, she can't move. She stands frozen, staring at him as disbelief floods her. Then her body finally responds. She runs, stumbling, throwing herself into his arms. He catches her with a force that almost knocks the breath from both of them. He holds her like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. "You scared me to death." His voice cracks against her hair. "Where were you? Why didn't you call? I thought—" He breaks off, unable to continue, burying his face in her shoulder. His lungs shake with uneven breaths. Linda melts against him, sobbing openly, her fear and loneliness finally breaking free. Her fingers clutch his shirt as if he might disappear like a dream. Quang cups her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. His voice trembles, thick with emotion. "Don't ever disappear like that again. I thought I'd lost you forever." She shakes her head, tears streaming. She can't speak. She doesn't have the strength. She only holds him tighter. Under the cold moonlight, their shadows merge. Two broken souls locking together, finding warmth in the middle of a night that had nearly devoured one of them whole. Later, in the tiny kitchen lit by a flickering oil lamp, Linda sits huddled on a small wooden stool. Her hands tremble as she tries to warm them over a cup of ginger tea. Quang sits beside her, so close his shoulder touches hers, his hand covering hers to stop the shaking. "Tell me everything," he says softly. She nods. Her throat tightens, but she begins. She tells him about the days she spent on the run, the fear that hunted her like an animal, the night she hid in an abandoned shed, the moment she thought she wouldn't make it back alive. Her voice quivers as she recounts being robbed and chased. Quang's grip on her hand tightens with every detail, but his eyes widen in shock when she reaches the part she's been avoiding, the part she still struggles to believe happened. "My ex-husband," she whispers, gaze fixed on the lamp flame. "He's gone." Quang's breath stills. "Gone? What do you mean?" Linda swallows hard. "He was arrested. The police caught him last week." Her voice shakes, not from fear, but from the lingering trauma that still coils around her like barbed wire. "I didn't see it. I wasn't there, but I heard it from the neighbors when I passed through the village outside town. They said the police had been tracking him for a while. He got caught trying to run again. Quang's jaw clenches, relief and anger battling in his eyes. He pulls her closer. "You should have told me sooner." "I didn't trust it," she murmurs. "I kept thinking he would show up again, that maybe it wasn't true." Quang wraps his arm around her, pressing a reassuring kiss on the top of her head. "It's over, Linda. He can't hurt you anymore." She trembles, because part of her still isn't sure. But sitting there in the dim kitchen, with Quang's solid warmth beside her, with the steady beat of his heartbeat anchoring her, she lets herself believe it, even if just for tonight. And when he whispers, "Sleep, I'm right here," she closes her eyes. For the first time in days, the darkness outside no longer terrifies her. The next morning crawls in slowly, soft beams of sunlight slipping through the slatted window. Linda blinks awake, disoriented for a moment. The faint chirping of birds in the yard mixes with the warm steadiness of Quang's breathing beside her. He had stayed by her side the entire night, never once loosening his hold, never once drifting far enough for her to feel alone. She studies his sleeping face. His brows are still furrowed, as if even in sleep he's carrying the weight of last night's terror with him. The sight brings a fresh surge of emotion to her chest, but this time it's not fear, it's gratitude. Deep, aching gratitude for the one person who has never turned his back on her, even when she vanished without a trace. Quang stirs, sensing her movement. He opens his eyes slowly, voice hoarse. "You're awake? How do you feel?" "Better," she whispers, though her voice cracks, a little calmer. He sits up, brushing her messy hair away from her face. "Good. Today, we'll take things slowly. You don't need to think about anything stressful. Not yet." But Linda lowers her gaze, suddenly unsettled. "Quang, about what I told you last night, about him being arrested." She swallows hard, struggling to gather her thoughts. "I still don't understand how it happened. It feels unreal." Quang doesn't rush her. He simply stays close, giving her room to breathe. So she begins explaining again, this time calmer, clearer, but still haunted. "When I was running, I passed by a far-off cluster of houses. I was starving, exhausted. I didn't even know where I was anymore, but I overheard some women talking." Her fingers twist into the blanket. "They said the police had finally caught him. They had been gathering evidence for months, watching every move he made. They were waiting for the right time." Quang's jaw tenses. "What did they charge him with?" Linda hesitates. "A lot. Things I didn't even know about. Fraud, violence, and debts he tried to bury by blaming others. And when he tried to flee again, that's when they took him." Quang's eyes darken, not with fear, but with a protective anger that simmers beneath the surface. "You should have been safe long ago. If only they'd caught him sooner." Linda shakes her head quickly. "No, Quang. Don't think like that. What matters is, it's done. He's gone. But last night," she closes her eyes, voice trembling. "Last night, alone in this house, I kept thinking he would come back anyway, that it was all just some rumor." Quang reaches out, gently lifting her chin so she meets his gaze. "Listen to me. What you heard was the truth. He's behind bars, where he belongs. And even if, Just hypothetically, anything ever changed, I would still stand in front of you. You're not fighting alone anymore. His firmness, his certainty, sends warmth blooming through her chest. For the first time since fleeing, Linda feels like she can breathe without her lungs shaking. Quang gets to his feet, stretching stiff muscles. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. Then we'll have breakfast. You haven't eaten properly in days. She nods, though her body still feels fragile. The warm water from the clay jar stings her cut feet, but the ritual, washing away the dust and fear, helps her reclaim a piece of herself. Quang cooks simple rice porridge over the small stove, glancing back at her every few minutes as if checking she hasn't vanished again. They eat together in silence at first, a soft, healing silence, but eventually Linda speaks. Quang, these past days, I thought I'd never see you again. I kept thinking that even if I survived, he'd destroy everything in my life, including you. She pauses, swallowing. I didn't want to drag you into my nightmare. You never dragged me into anything, Quang says firmly. I chose to stand by you. She looks down, tears welling. Do you hate me? For leaving without a word? What kind of question is that? He reaches across the low table, taking her hand. Linda, I don't care where you went. I only care that you're here now. Don't ever think you're a burden. His sincerity hits her like sunlight after a storm. For a long moment, she simply lets the warmth of his hand linger over hers, grounding her. Then something inside her releases, a knot of shame, fear, confusion, and she finally whispers the truth she'd been hiding even from herself. I thought I had to face everything alone, that no one would understand what I'd been through. Not even you. Quang squeezes her hand gently. You don't have to explain anything. But if you ever want to tell me, I'll listen. Every word. Linda breathes shakily. Thank you. The morning settles around them. The chickens cluck in the yard. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. Life slowly returns to its usual rhythm. But inside Linda, a new foundation is being built from the shattered pieces she brought home last night. After breakfast, Quang steps outside to check the yard. Linda follows him to the doorway, hugging herself against the sunlight. He scans the area with cautious eyes. You didn't lock the gate last night? I was too scared to remember, she admits softly. He walks over and latches it firmly. It's okay. Nothing happened. But from now on, let's be careful. Linda's breath catches. The word "let's" wraps her in a strange, unexpected comfort. She's not alone. Not in fear, not in rebuilding. When Quang returns to the porch, he pauses and studies her carefully. What will you do from here on? He asks gently. She looks out over the garden, the path, the fields beyond. For the first time in a very long time, the future isn't a dark tunnel. It's blurry, yes, but no longer hopeless. I don't know, she admits, but I want to start over, properly this time. Quang nods. Good, and I'll help you, whatever you decide. Her chest tightens again, this time with a different kind of ache, one that makes her hope nearly painful. Quang, Linda whispers, voice trembling. Do you really mean that? He steps forward, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Linda, I came here last night prepared to search for you until my legs gave out. I'm not going anywhere. Her breath hitches. Her eyes sting. She leans forward, resting her forehead against his chest. He wraps his arms around her, steady and sure. The world seems to slow, soften, quiet around them, and she finally says the words she's been afraid to speak aloud. "I'm so glad you found me." Quang's voice is low, almost a promise. "I always will." They stand there on the porch, surrounded by sunlight, the scent of morning earth, and the lingering echoes of everything they survived.